and we're sorry for the delay. So I'll get started with our introduction. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our series, America and the Holocaust, a series of colloquies. We thank our partners for today's event, Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Resource Education Center of Florida. In each of these sessions, Dr. Michael Berenbaum will explore this complicated debate. Each session will feature a scholar whose work will shed new light on the topic and challenge us to reframe our understanding of the complex portrait of national inaction. Today's session will feature a discussion surrounding Refuge Must Be Given, Eleanor Roosevelt and the Holocaust with John Sears. For those of you joining for the first time today, my name is Erica Fox-Zabusky, and I'm the Operations Manager with Classrooms Without Borders. Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. We offer unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. We do this through an authentic exploration of a complex narrative, engaging with scholars, fellow educators, experts, and contemporary witnesses, with the primary focus being the importance that historic place plays in our shared history. What has happened in a place can shape, directly or indirectly, how people see it, feel about it, and create narratives around it. This can range from the collective pride through to communal grief experienced after a tragedy. Such memories and stories are as much a part of the identity of a place as the bricks and mortar. This is the foundation on which CWB was built over 11 years ago. We're grateful for all your support over the years, and most especially these past 3 years of navigating an expanded presence for CWB, while also supporting our robust offerings. Over the past 3 years, we have offered 433 virtual programs with over 72,000 registrants, reaching almost 60 countries and most of the states in the United States. If you would like to make a donation to support our organization, I'll drop the link in the chat for you. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest. Dr. Michael Berenbaum is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and historical films. He is director of the Ziggy Sealing Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, where he is also a professor of Jewish studies. Mr. Sears served as executive director of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute from 1986 until 1999, and as associate editor of the Eleanor Roosevelt Papers from 2000 to 2007. The Eleanor Roosevelt Papers, Volume 1, appeared in 2007. Before joining the Roosevelt Institute, he taught at Tufts, Boston University, and Vassar. Sears divides his time between Northampton, Massachusetts, and Hawley, a hill town in western Massachusetts, where his paternal ancestors settled in the late 1700s. He grows trees and produces maple syrup on the land he owns. As a board member of the Sons and Daughters of Hawley, the town's historical society, he helped create Hawley's Old Town Common Historic Site. Sears served on the Hawley Select Board from 2013 until 2017, and he currently serves on the board of directors of the Disability History Museum. Please send your questions to Michael in the chat, and we'll try our best to answer them all. So with this, I think is Mr. Sears here, and if not, we can hear a little bit from you, Michael, and
okay, we're going to have to play this by ear. John Sears, who's written a marvelous book on Eleanor Roosevelt, both in the Holocaust and Zion and the establishment of the State of Israel, is trying to get on with us. He has been snowed in and can't come down from his mountaintop.
I am on.
I'm hoping I may answer a call in the middle because I'm hoping that he can get access.
He's here, Michael.
I'm on.
He's here.
Here I am.
Okay, so put up John.
I'm actually here.
Then I have a much easier job because all I have to do is ask John about his book. John, give us the full title of your book.
It is Refuge Must Be Given, Eleanor Roosevelt, the Jewish Plight at the Founding of Israel.
So we are going to have a wonderful conversation in which I'm going to ask, and then you're going to ask everything you ever want to know about Eleanor Roosevelt and her role. And this is another side of the American experience during the Holocaust. John, why don't you begin and give us a little bit about Eleanor Roosevelt's background, and then we'll talk about the role that she played as First Lady, most especially in her human relations, I guess, the eyes and ears and legs of her husband.
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt grew up in a wealthy family, but she was orphaned very young and was sent to a boarding school in England called Allenswood, which was headed by a French woman named Marie Souvestre. And Marie Souvestre was a feminist and a liberal who encouraged her female students to become interested in the problems of society. And so that's where she was also, Eleanor Roosevelt was fluent in French from an early age. She had a French tutor. And so she, I would say, became an internationalist very early and an activist because of the influence of this wonderful teacher she had. She grew up in an anti-Semitic culture. This elite New York society that she was a member of was anti-Semitic. And one of the interesting things about her, given what a great promoter of Israel eventually, and a passionate opponent of anti-Semitism, she continued to express anti-Semitic views into her 30s, really, in private correspondence with her mother-in-law, for example. The interesting thing about her as a first lady, we haven't had a first lady like her since, and there certainly was no first lady like her before, because when FDR got polio in the early 20s, he stepped aside from politics. His name was kept alive by his close associate and by Eleanor Roosevelt. She became very active politically in the 1920s. She remember, the women had just gotten the vote. She became active in the Democratic Party, in the women's division of the Democratic Party. She got to know labor leaders. She got to know people in consumer affairs. She got to know people in public health. And she became a leader in the League of Women Voters, in the Women's Consumer League. So by the time that FDR became governor which was in 1928, and became active politically again, she was already established as a power in her own right, as a political actor in her own right. She had her own constituency among women, among people in labor, among the Jews she got to know who were active in these organizations that she worked with. So she remained active into the White House years and had her own agenda to pursue, which wasn't always in line with FDR's agenda. And
when I read your book, John, I had the feeling that FDR saw things politically and Eleanor Roosevelt saw things deeply humanly. Is that a correct perception?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was a humanitarian too, but he was primarily, yes, a politician and had to think about all sorts of political factors. And she was a humanitarian. She was I would say, an idealist. In the early 30s, I would describe her as on the pacifist end of people approaching international problems. She became a close associate of the leader of the Quaker organization, the Society of Friends, and through that, she became active in the peace movement. There was a very strong peace movement, both nationally and internationally. She was also closely associated with Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the founder of the League of Women Voters and one of Eleanor's mentors. Carrie Chapman Catt had founded an women's international peace organization. And so Eleanor became active in giving speeches about peace, and urging the United States to join a world court because we had not joined the League of Nations, and therefore we didn't have the sort of influence we might have had we done that.
But the Quakers at that time were deeply active also in America receiving refugees.
Yes. One of the interesting thing about the Quakers is that after World War I, when there was an embargo on Germany, there was no food going into Germany between the armistice and the Versailles Treaty. Many Germans died during that period because of poor health from malnutrition. And the Quakers, although they were a small organization, were very active in bringing relief. And they stayed active in Germany. And when in 1932, or 1933, when after Hitler had come to power and the Jews began to be persecuted, the Quakers became active in giving the Jews who were being thrown out of jobs, giving them relief, but also helping them get visas to emigrate. They had offices in Berlin and Vienna and Paris, and they were very active in helping Jews and working closely with Jewish organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee, and cooperating with them and getting Jewish refugees out. So Clarence Pickett, who was the head of the American Friends Service Committee, became a close friend and associate of Eleanor Roosevelt. They initially over helping the out-of-work coal miners in West Virginia, who were refugees themselves of a sort, and helping to set up a town called Arthurdale in West Virginia for out-of-work coal miners, and working on refugees. So that Eleanor Roosevelt was very keenly aware of what was going on in Germany from Clarence Pickett and from other people she knew. James MacDonald, who's a very interesting figure, who was head of the Foreign Policy Association and knew both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. He eventually became a high commissioner for refugees coming out of Germany for the League of Nations. He did that for a couple of years, found it impossible. When he came back to the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt would arrange for James MacDonald to meet with the president, spend a couple of hours with him, reporting on what he had encountered in Europe and what sort of efforts he was making and the frustration he was having in finding places for refugees to go who were leaving Germany
And
in great
McDonald
numbers.
also became the first American ambassador to the state of Israel.
That's right, eventually.
When it was newly established, and he came there with a reputation of enormously helping refugees. John, let me ask you, and I guess this could take 3 hours, not 1 hour, but I'm going to ask you to almost in a condensed form, tell us a little bit about the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and her influence on him, and when push came to shove, at certain moments, her lack of influence on him.
Right, right. As many of you know, Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin had a crisis in the early 20s. Before he got polio, she discovered that he was having an affair with her social secretary. And she confronted him about this, and she offered a divorce, but his mother said, "I'll cut you off if you get divorced." And so they made an agreement at that time that they would stay married, but they would lead more independent lives. And it was soon after that that FDR got polio, which made it even, she took care of him, but it also meant it was essential for her to get out there and lead her own life and become active politically, as I mentioned before. So they had a partnership rather than a romantic marriage after that. And but it was a great partnership. I think it was one of the great political partnerships in history. And they supported each other. They didn't always agree. And sometimes publicly they didn't always agree. But they supported each other, and they made it possible. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was very essential to FDR's success in many areas. But she would push him on a lot of issues. For example, one of the problems that made it difficult for the United States to criticize Germany's policies against Jews, was that in the United States, we were treating our African-American population cruelly. There were lynchings were very common at that time, and they were public, and they were advertised in the papers. Eleanor Roosevelt worked to push for the passage of a federal anti-lynching law, which actually had the votes in the Senate. But the Southern congressmen and senators who controlled the committees were against an anti-lynching law, and FDR needed their support in order to get his legislation through, like the Social Security bill. And so Eleanor kept pushing him year after year. The bill came up, in 33 and 34 and 35, and it never got to a vote because of the control that the Southern congressmen and senators had. So that's a good example of where, she was pushing one way and he just felt politically, come back to Michael's earlier point about politically versus, humanitarianly, he felt politically he couldn't support publicly an anti-lynching law. So she wasn't, successful in persuading him to do so.
John, one of the things I read in your book, which I found intriguing, was that she very often invited people whom she wanted to get on the president's agenda to dinner in the White House.
Yep.
And
yeah.
Was that her way of making sure that the president heard a range of views that might not get through the protective what shall we say, the protective net that is always around every president?
Yeah, and the State Department, which was full of anti-Semitic people, and FDR often went around his own State Department through people like Harry Hopkins. So I've lost your question. I'm sorry.
The White House dinners.
Right,
Dinner at the
yes,
White House,
exactly.
getting
Exactly.
people
So,
around.
so people like Clarence Pickett, whom she had this close association with, was often in the White House and had time with FDR to talk to him about what he had learned. Pickett made 2 trips to Germany during the 30s to go to these centers where the Quakers were helping refugees in Berlin and in Vienna, and reported back about those trips. Alice Hamilton, who was a very interesting woman, who was actually on the faculty of the Harvard Medical School in public health. She went to Germany with a friend and came back and reported in detail at a private meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt and some of Lillian Walden. And then Eleanor invited Alice Hamilton to Hyde Park to talk to the president. So he got firsthand reports. The other one was James McDonald. When James McDonald came back after meeting, James McDonald actually met Hitler in 1933, in April of 1933. And when he came back, he got in touch with Eleanor Roosevelt and said, I'd like to come talk to you about my meeting with Hitler and what I've learned. And she said she invited him to the White House and made sure he spent a couple of hours with FDR reporting what Hitler had told him, including Hitler said, the world wants to get rid of the Jews. We will show them how. That was in 1933. So those are the kind of things he wasn't going to be hearing from the State Department. You know, he got
we
these.
We also want the teachers who are attending, the people who are attending, to remember that Hitler in 1933 was not yet conceiving of death, murder, and what we later called the final solution. He was considering essentially German policy was the isolation, the economic deprivation of deprivation of Jews, essentially forced immigration.
Right, exactly.
Coerced them to leave. Talk for a moment about Eleanor's own reach to the American public with her column, My Day.
Right. Yes. In 1935, at the suggestion of her friend, the journalist Lorena Hickok, she began writing a daily column, six days a week, and it was widely syndicated. She was one of the most widely syndicated columnists in the United States from 1935 until her death at 62. She would every day she would dictate these columns, and they were initially often, you know, about her. It was called My Day, so it was about what I did today. And sometimes it was, you know, not anything terribly interesting or politically important, but gradually they became more important, particularly after I would say after FDR's death, but even before that, she would deal with issues and that had an influence on people. I can give you an example of that, which is after the war. In 1947, the UN passed the partition plan for Palestine, which would have created an Arab and a Jewish state as a solution to the conflict there. And the State Department opposed the partition plan. Eleanor Roosevelt became its most passionate supporter in the Truman administration. The Jews in Palestine accepted the plan, but the Arabs opposed it and began attacking Jewish settlements. The United States started to backtrack and to say, well, when the British mandate ends in May, the British said, we're leaving in May. That's the end of our mandate, which had been set up after World War I. And the United States said, we're going to replace that, proposed replacing the British mandate with a UN trusteeship. And Eleanor Roosevelt was furious. For one thing, it was just going to kick the can down the road. I mean, how is that going to solve the conflict? And who was going to enforce this trusteeship? Who is going to keep the peace? And so she wrote these letters to Truman and to Marshall, Secretary of State Marshall, saying how she was opposed to this, and that she was going to have to say so publicly, which meant that she would be writing. They knew this. I mean, that she would write her columns about it, which could be widely syndicated, and it was politically would have been very bad for them if she'd resigned. So they tried to persuade her of the wisdom of their position, but she was not persuaded, and she wrote 2 columns opposing the administration. She had offered to resign if that was embarrassing.
I have the sense that throughout her tenure as First Lady and afterwards, forces in the State Department might have said, we have a problem called Eleanor.
Right.
And that is that Eleanor was, and you present a lot of correspondence in which the president forwards Eleanor's contentions for action and specific causes. The State Department gets back to Eleanor on this problem without actually handling it.
Right. Yeah, I think the most interesting example of that, to go back to the refugee issue, is that Eleanor's great opponent in the State Department was Breckinridge Long, who was an assistant secretary of state and oversaw the visa division of the State Department. And he was anti-Semitic, he was anti-immigrant, and he was excessively worried about spies and subversives being salted into the refugee groups and getting into the United States and causing trouble, threatening our security. So James McDonald, who was by that time the chairman of the president's committee, advisory committee on political refugees, which FDR had set up after the Anschluss in 1938. He complained that the State Department wasn't doing what they had promised to do, which was to give emergency visas to political refugees who were trapped in unoccupied France. This would have been in 1941.
So we should touch on that because we had a session here with Pierre Savage on Varian Fry.
Right.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about her involvement with Varian Fry, which centered on southern France.
Right. So
in 1940, at a time when the United States had diplomatic relations with France. Remember, we did not have diplomatic relations with France only after war was declared on December 11th, 1941, and France then became a German allied and occupied country. So prior to that, in 1940, we did have diplomatic relations. And tell us a little bit from your perspective about the work of Varian Fry and also the role of Eleanor Roosevelt in that.
Yeah. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the founders of the Emergency Rescue Committee, now called the International Rescue Committee. It's still a very important organization. It's working in Ukraine and Syria. she helped found that organization, and Marion Fry was excuse me, I've got it, the sun is coming into here. Sorry. They were trying to find someone to go to Marseille in unoccupied France and become an agent to contact these refugees who were hiding there. They were labor leaders. They were leaders of political parties like socialist parties that were opposed to fascism. They were artists and intellectuals and writers, a lot of prominent people, but not just prominent people, who were in danger. And so they needed to send someone there who would contact them and then help them get visas and get them out of the country. So the person the emergency rescue sent there as an agent was Varian Fry, who was very successful in his work. And when they were trying to arrange for him to go, it was Eleanor Roosevelt who helped him get a visa, and a passport to go to France, to unoccupied France. And then she would get reports back through the Emergency Rescue Committee. She would get reports from him about the problems he was having with the State Department. Initially, there was a consul there named Bingham, who was very sympathetic to refugees and worked with Varian Fry to get them out. But that consul was then removed and sent to somewhere else, I think somewhere in Latin America.
Sent to Argentina. That was Hiram Bingham.
Bingham, right. And
very, very interesting thing is Hiram Bingham concealed his papers his papers relating to this period in his fireplace, behind his fireplace.
Yeah.
So he was worried that some of his role might really be discovered. I did a series of interviews with his family when they found his papers. It was quite interesting. Let's go on a couple of specific events. Eleanor Roosevelt attended the pageant "We Shall Never Die," which was in Washington, D.C. That represented again a very high-level White House concern over the message of what was happening to the Jews. This is April of 1943. This is a time when America is being informed in particular ways, not quite believing, but being informed of what's been happening. So talk a little bit about the pageant and her recollections of the pageant and her description of it.
Well, the pageant was a presentation by the actors in the pageant, represented groups who'd been persecuted and exterminated, and they said they would sort of tell their stories and then say, "We remember us," and it made a great impression on Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was approached by Peter Bergson, who was the head of the organization behind that pageant. She met with him 2 or 3 times, and he tried to persuade her to speak out. She had, the position of the American government was that the best way to save the Jews is to win the war, and everything should go into winning the war. And there's nothing we can do until then, really. Well, there were many Jews in the United States and other people who didn't think that was true. There were things that could be done. And Eleanor Roosevelt initially took the government position is, the way to do this is to win the war. And but she came around, she wrote a column finally after meeting with Bergson, in which she said, I don't know what can be done, but we would be morally wrong if we didn't do something. There's something morally has to be done. So that's as far as she got in supporting that position.
By the way, historians would come to almost the same judgment. There's one of my favorite, and I just want to remind the people who attended, we had one session on Varian Fry, we had one session on Ben Hecht, who wrote the pageant.
Right.
And now we're talking about Eleanor Roosevelt and her response to the pageant. And remember, she's touching Ben Hecht, she's touching Varian Fry. But historians have come to the judgment that the problem was not so much that America had an effective answer to what was happening, at least not for a period of time we're going to see in a little while, but rather that we didn't do anything. Walter Lacour once put it, the optimists said something should be done, the pessimists said nothing could be done, and the optimists weren't even listened to. Optimism meant we had to do something. And the moral judgment of America is we didn't do anything, we didn't do enough. And we certainly didn't do enough. Let's move forward a little bit and then we'll answer some questions. Tell us about—
I might say, I just wanted to mention that we did finally in 1944 set up the World Refugee Board. That was through the efforts of Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury and a close friend of both Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's. The closest Jewish friends of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were Henry and Eleanor Morgenthau, very important people in the administration and in their lives.
Who were neighbors, and both were, quotation marks, gentlemen farmers.
Right. They were neighbors in Dutchess County. And it was Eleanor Morgenthau who encouraged Eleanor to speak to Jewish groups, so that beginning in 1933, Eleanor Roosevelt was speaking to large conventions of Hadassah, the Women's Zionist Organization, and other Jewish groups. And she refused to speak to any group that excluded Jews. And so Eleanor Morgenthau, and when Eleanor Morgenthau was denied admission to the Cosmos Club in New York, which Eleanor had helped found because she was Jewish, Eleanor Roosevelt resigned from that organization. So she was an important part of Eleanor's fight against anti-Semitism in the 30s.
Take us after the war to her visit to DP camps.
Excuse me? Oh, okay. So, yeah, after the war, Truman appointed Eleanor Roosevelt to the first American delegation to the United Nations. Of course, all the other members of the delegation were men, prominent men like John Foster Dulles. And Eleanor Roosevelt was appointed to the Third Committee, which dealt with humanitarian affairs, which meant that she dealt with the DP camps in Europe, the displaced persons camps in Germany, where there were 200,000 Jews, other refugees who were stranded there. And the Soviet Union thought that the refugees should be forced to go back to their countries of origin. Many of them didn't want to go back for obvious reasons, that they were now countries that were behind what we later called the Iron Curtain. So Eleanor Roosevelt ended up debating Andrei Vyshinsky about this issue of the refugees, and she did an excellent job. She won the debate, and the refugees were allowed to choose where they went. The problem was that not enough countries were willing to take them in, or take enough of them in. But that was an important part of her role after the war. And she, after the first United Nations meeting, which took place in London, she went to Germany and visited DP camps, including Zeilsheim, which was a Jewish camp. And that made a big impression on her, and led to her interest in, and many of the Jews in that camp told her they wanted to go to Palestine. And that had a big influence on her interest in Jewish settlements in Palestine, and ultimately her support for the establishment of a Jewish state.
And her support for the establishment of the Jewish state was deep and really profound. She visited Israel and had lots of friends in Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, she became, she got interested in youth aliyah in the 1930s. That was, again, something that Eleanor Morgenthau introduced her to through Hadassah. And Hadassah was the American sponsor of youth aliyah. And youth aliyah brought Jewish children, some of them orphans, some of them just from families living in countries where they had no future. And Youth Aliyah brought them to Palestine, trained them in agriculture and various trades to become really builders of the country, particularly the kibbutzim. And Eleanor Roosevelt got interested in them, in that organization. And in 1952, she became world patron of Youth Aliyah and went to Israel 4 times in that capacity, visited Youth Aliyah training facilities, youth villages, some of which were actually run by the children primarily. She visited kibbutzim. She became friends with David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and other leaders of Israel. She became very close friends of Joseph Baratz, who was head of the first kibbutz in Israel, Dagania, up near the Sea of Galilee. She visited that kibbutz every time she went to Israel. And she visited the health facilities, which Hadassah had also founded there, clinics, hospitals. So she got to know very, very intimately it was very exciting. She found Israel a very exciting place to be. And it was at that time. I mean, because it was
she also
new country.
did something else that was extraordinary, which is, and this is where I got a sense of her personal dimension. She followed through with some of the people she had met in DP camps and saw them later.
That's right.
Not only the leaders, not only the elites, but in a very real sense, people. She just
Absolutely.
she collected people.
Yeah. Well, she treated people, whether they were, leaders or whether they were poor farmers or whatever, she treated everybody the same, and she was interested in their lives. And people knew
John,
that.
let's go through a couple of questions that are asked. Did any of the anti-Semitic State Department individuals who blocked visas incur any damage or retribution during their lifetime? And did their actions become known during their lifetime?
I'm not sure I understood the question.
In other words, did somebody like Breckinridge Long's actions become known during his lifetime? Let me help you by answering that in one sense. Henry Morgenthau brought to the president a memo which had been put on his desk on the acquiescence of the State Department to the murder of European Jews.
Yeah.
And this was a thorough expose of the role of the State Department, included up not only accused it of a cover-up of lying, not only of not helping rescue, but actually hampering rescue.
Right.
And President met with Morgenthau, and that's one of the catalytic elements that led to the establishment of the War Refugee Board, because he asked Morgenthau, "What do you want?" And meaning, "What can I do?" And Morgenthau said, "I want the War Refugee Board." We have a question here that I'm going to throw back, not to you so much, but Erica asked a question. Did Eleanor Roosevelt ever try to explain why Jews were not helped during the war? I want to remind our participants, there's a phenomenal one-man play by David Strahan on the life of Jan Karski, who met with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and who was a messenger from Poland. And it's on PBS. It's available now on PBS for the next 30 days. It was broadcast on Monday night. And for the sheer artistry of it, let me suggest you spend the hour and 20 minutes with it. We have a talk back afterwards that some of you may find very interesting. We have a third question. Which is somebody asks whether there's any truth that Hitler did not commit suicide but escaped to South America along with other Nazis. That's an urban myth. There is ample evidence that Hitler did commit suicide, but many Nazi leaders did escape to South America. And there was something called the Rat Line, which even went through the Vatican to facilitate their escape. And they ended up in places like Argentina. Mengele ended up in Brazil after going through Argentina. Eichmann obviously was in Argentina, and there was an exile community. John, let's ask a personal question of you. How did you get involved so deeply in the life and career of Eleanor Roosevelt?
Well, I was the executive director of the Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Institute for 13 years, I guess. It's based in Hyde Park. It's a nonprofit organization associated with the FDR Library. And then I was associate editor of Eleanor Roosevelt's public papers for 6 years. But what got me interested in this particular subject was that correspondence that I spoke of earlier between Eleanor Roosevelt, President Truman, and Secretary of State Marshall. Because when I was editing the first volume of Eleanor Roosevelt's public papers, which are the public papers of her career after FDR's death, so I was reading those letters and letters associated with them, and I got very interested in her, why she'd taken such a strong stand, what led to her taking such a strong stand in favor of the creation of a Jewish state. And so I wanted to begin at the beginning, and I went back and researched the 30s and her relationship with Jews and her initial anti-Semitism and how she grew out of that, and became outspoken person fighting anti-Semitism in her column and other places. And then how she participated in the debate within the Truman administration about the future of Palestine. She was, she would have preferred a multinational state. I mean, that's what she believed in. And she believed, in everyone having rights. She believed in diversity, what we'd call today diversity. She was a great champion of African Americans. As I said before, she was passionately opposed to lynching, and she was a liaison between the Black community, the African American community, and FDR. That was another role she played. She when I've again lost my train of thought. Where was she?
Her linkage to her humanitarian instincts really identified deeply, and you
right, yeah. So what I was saying was, I remember now. What I was saying was that she would have preferred a multi-ethnic state, and a state, and there were Jews who were in favor of that too, prominent, including Henrietta Zold, who was the founder of the Youth Aliyah, and the head of Hebrew University, and other prominent Jews who believe it should be a unified state. But Eleanor Roosevelt recognized, and the United Nations recognized, that the two parties were too opposed to each other, violently opposed to each other, that they weren't going to come to an agreement in which they could live together in the same government, and have a democratic government with both parties involved. And so she came reluctantly to support the partition plan as the only way to settle the conflict. And she was an optimist, and she thought that if they could just set up these two separate states, the idea of the partition plan was that there would be a kind of economic union. There'd be separate governments, separate territories controlled by the Arabs and by the Jews. There would be possibly Jews living in the Arab country, and Arabs living in the Jewish country, but they would be separate, except they would be a sort of economic union. And over time, Eleanor Roosevelt felt that they would work things out, and maybe they become a federation, or become something like Switzerland, or somehow become unified. And she continued to look at the situation optimistically, because she felt if the Arabs would only resettle the refugees, her position on the refugees, she was very sympathetic with the Arab refugees. She supported aiding them, but she felt very strongly that the Arab states should take them in. They should be resettled in Arab states. And if the Arab states could do that, and could recognize Israel's existence, and create a state of their own, that over time, that the Jews in Israel would help develop the whole region. And we can see a little of that happening now. It's not helping the Palestinians themselves, but these new relationships between Israel and some of the Arab countries.
That's the ongoing dilemma, essentially, when you talk of the two-state solution.
Yeah.
I'm going to turn it back to Erica for a moment, but let me say a couple of things. Next time we are going to, and we're not going to be in the normal cycle of the third Wednesday, because that's Passover, but we are going to meet during that week. But the most important thing is, next time we're going to have a filmmaker and film historian, Michael Berlin, and we're going to talk about what was the portrayal in American popular culture. There wasn't television, but there was certainly a combination of movies and radio of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews during the period of time between 1933 and we'll go a little bit beyond 45 to about 47, 48. So Erica's going to give you that. John, I apologize to everybody for the delay, but I learned an ancient Yiddish phrase, you can't dance at two weddings with one rear end, but we often all try. And we will see you next time. John, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, let me again suggest you read a very interesting book about a very incredible woman by a very fine scholar, and that is Refuge Must Be Given by John Sears. Eleanor Roosevelt. John, what's the subtitle?
It is Eleanor Roosevelt, The Jewish Plight and the Founding of Israel. And thank you, Michael, for inviting me to participate. I enjoyed it.
And the founding of Israel. Thank you very much. Back to you, Erica. And again, our apologies. And for some of you, my apologies that I was eating throughout, but I have not yet had breakfast, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We've been in sessions all morning long. And my morning began at 6:30, and I've been in sessions since then. Thank you very much. Erica, you're muted. Erica, you're muted.
You'd think I would have learned by now. So Michael and John, thank you so much for this discussion. It was really fascinating to learn some of the background of what was going on in American politics and in the White House during that time. And we also want to thank our partners today for the event. We have Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida, who we work with. And as Michael mentioned, we hope you'll join us next month for the 4th session, which will be April 26th, so we avoid the Passover holiday. And next Thursday, the second part of our 8-part series exploring the multifaceted discipline of Holocaust studies through unique and previously unexplored lenses. And our second session will feature achieving legal accountability for World War II Nazi crimes, experiences of the Israel National Police and the U.S. Department of Justice, with Eli M. Rosenbaum and Dr. Tamir Hod. You can sign up for these events and more at our website, www.cwbpgh.org. And as you know, we do not charge for these events, our virtual programming, as our mission is to reach as many people as possible. I saw today we have someone from Spain who is attending, and if you'd like to make a donation to support these programs, we appreciate it. You can visit our website, and I will see if I can try to do 2 things at once and put the link in the chat. I also just want to mention briefly that the program that Michael mentioned, which I had the wonderful good fortune to see the other night, is Jan Karski, Remember This. We'll send a link to that also in the email that follows up when we get the video recording put up on our website. We'll send a link to that and the link to the couple of resources mentioned. And we hope you will stay safe and healthy. We hope to see you all again soon, and we wish you all a Zishin Pesach. And with that, yeah, I'm going to put the link. Oops, I think I just put it into one person, but hope you have a good day, and thank you again for your patience, and we'll hope to see you next time.